Good afternoon and welcome to Right Now. I'm Chris Reddy here on 95.3 FM WILI. This is our Thursday, January 29th episode of the show. And for the first time since the show's beginning, I am by myself hosting. Neither of my co-hosts are in studio today. And I wish them good luck in their projects this afternoon. They are both busy with their businesses, and I hope they're staying warm. I hope that they're correcting all the problems that people are experiencing from this past storm. I hope that everyone survived. I know we joked about it a little bit last week on the show about preparations for the bad weather that was coming in here. Definitely turned out to be a significant snow event, and I hope that everyone turned out okay. They're able to dig themselves out in the past few days here. I certainly did spend a lot of time out there doing some work, helping both my neighbors and making sure that everyone is okay through this weather. So I hope that continues. Before we get the show started, I want to take a moment to thank Wyndham Industries, Building Strong Foundations for Tomorrow, one of our sponsors here at WILI. And I also want to remind all of our listeners that if you would like to review any of the content of any of our previous episodes from the past few months, you can go to WILI.com, go to the podcasts pull-down menu, and you can select Right Now. You can listen to all of our previous episodes in podcast format, and you can also go to YouTube and search Right Now, and you can see the video format of our show here on WILI. So we have two things we're going to talk about today. First is going to be a little bit more of a federal level concern with fraud. This is continuing some of the conversations we've had in the past few weeks. And then we're going to kind of drill down a little bit into a state level issue, one that I had highlighted back in, I want to say October, that dealt with nonprofit organizations and some of the funding and what has happened with not only funds that were simply lost in wire transfers to fraudulent recipients, but also something that I've highlighted in previous episodes, which is this idea of kind of a nonprofit industrial complex that is really regulating our legislature here in Connecticut. And it really comes to the idea of one-party rule for the past 40 years. I've mentioned this numerous times in previous episodes. So we have two different segments we're going to talk about today, before and after our commercial break at the bottom of the hour. And the first one is going to talk about something that you probably heard highlighted back in July of last year, but really this is now starting to come back to light again. And this has to do with USAID, USAID, and the bribery scheme that was uncovered back in July of 2025, where it involved USAID officials and 8A contractors they're referred to. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit more detail in just a moment here. But it was to the tune of $550 million worth of briberies in this scheme that went down, that was highlighted last year. To kind of look at this in a little bit more detail and talk about some of the fraud that's being uncovered now related to this, the Small Business Administration, and to give you a little bit of history to this, originating back in the late 1960s and early 70s, the Small Business Administration began what was known as an 8A program. President Johnson instituted this with the idea that after a lot of unrest with civil rights that was at a highlight in the 1960s and early 1970s, that there would be a program from the federal government that encouraged small businesses that at the time they termed were minority owned to be able to access government contracts and the ability to compete with larger corporations to make themselves competitive in that U.S. government contract market. This has changed several times over the history, but while it was first instituted in the late 60s, Congress officially established the 8A program as part of the Small Business Administration in 1978. It was expanded again in 1988 by the Clinton administration. This really tried to include certain, what they felt were underrepresented organizations or groups And what they really looked for then were Native American Indian tribes, and also at that time, they looked at Native Hawaiian organizations as ones that should also be included as beneficiaries in this 8A program. Well, this all sounds great, and I'll give you the exact details that go into the 8A program in just a minute. What we really saw was a huge expansion that added a large number of small businesses to this 8A designation under the Biden administration and during that presidency. When we look at it overall, around 4,300 businesses in the United States are the ones who benefit from this 8A designation. What it really does is it identifies a small business that is 51% or more owned by a disadvantaged individual or groups that also meet certain personal net worth and income and asset limit criteria. This is really designed to help socially and economically disadvantaged small businesses to access this federal contracting market. And what it really does is it offers not only training, but mentorship and access to not only sole source, but set aside contract opportunities to help grow and compete these businesses in the competitive government contract marketplace. That all sounds great and things that we can definitely support. These are things that we want to do. We want American manufactured products. We want our government to be supporting local businesses and small businesses that are trying to take advantage of these situations. What we saw happen under the Biden administration was that 2,200 of these 4,300 now small businesses were added in a very short amount of time. And one of the downsides to this was that it diverted a lot of the resources away from something that's called VetCert. And this is Veteran Small Business Certification Programs. And that resulted in a backlog of almost 2,700 veteran small business applications that finally were addressed at the beginning of 2025. Now, I mentioned July 2025 as a significant point in this because that's where the federal government really recognized that there was this bribery scheme that involved USAID and these 8A contractors. While bribery is something very different than what we are really starting to uncover now, and I'm going to dive into a little bit deeper in just one moment here, this was kind of like what shed light on the issue and what really brought this to concerns for both not only the federal government, but also the Department of Justice, the Department of War, and the organizations that oversee accountability in our government. One of the things that an SBA program does is that it enrolls these small businesses into a program that has really a 9-year initiative duration. 4 years of that is considered a developmental stage. 5 years of that is considered a transitional stage where you're going from a point where you are basically being handheld and led by the government and mentorships through larger corporations that already have existing government contracts to the point where you're able to independently as a small business work on your own, develop these contracts, and then provide and fulfill them. The concern that came about with 8A contracts and what's starting to be uncovered now is that those small businesses did not fulfill these obligations. What they really started to see was that many of these businesses were either shell corporations that did not actually complete the work that was contracted. And we're going to talk about that again in just 1 minute here. But the other idea was that they were pass-throughs. And the way that fraud happens in this pass-through, and we're going to talk about this in more detail in the second half of our show today also, through nonprofits, is that once you get through this network of organizations, in this case with the 8A programs, businesses that are now becoming not only shell corporations for other businesses that might not be eligible to meet the specifications set for these grant programs set aside by the Small Business Administration, or they are businesses that take these contracts from the federal government and then find another company that will do all the work for them, but skim 10 or 20 or 50% off the top. Think about the $1,000 toilet seats that we've heard about in the federal government. That's where this comes about. These are the things that we need to see cleaned up. We need transparency. We need to find a way to make these small businesses accountable for when they say they can complete a project, but then they can't, and they have to defer all this to another firm. Because as soon as we get through this web and this network where these funds transfer from a contracted small business to now a larger firm, or in the case of nonprofits, which we're going to talk about in the second segment, where it goes from one nonprofit to another to a third nonprofit, there's no transparency. There's no accountability. You can't follow where these funds go. And we're going to talk about that specifically in more detail in our second segment. To get back to the Small Business Administration and the 8A programs, December 5th, 2025 was a very significant date also. And this is when the Small Business Administration Office of General Counsel sent letters requiring that by January 5th of 2026, so just a couple of weeks ago, all of the financial records, the contracting and the subcontracting agreements, the employee records, the business ledgers from all 4,300 participating businesses in the 8A program for the past 3 years be submitted to the federal government and specifically the Office of General Counsel for audit. The reason why this is significant is because when you think about it, those requests are not things that a typical business would not be able to produce. These are things that your business should have on hand and available at any time when requested. Well, it turns out that 25% of these businesses did not even respond. They just simply didn't submit anything. They just said, nothing to see here, nothing to show, sorry. Right? In fact, it was 1,091 of these businesses. They've received over $5 billion since 2021, and now the Small Business Administration has had to suspend all of that funding, because we need to look at this in detail. The way that this happens, there's several different means that this type of fraud can occur under. And I've mentioned them, and I'm going to talk about them in a little bit more detail right now. The first is this idea of pass-through fraud. This is where an 8A firm or company wins a contract, but they secretly outsource either most or all of that work to a larger company that would otherwise be ineligible because they violate the program rules. It might be because they don't have 51% of the company is owned by someone who is classified as a disadvantaged individual, or that there's company assets that are above a limit criteria. Either way, one of these things that is commonly occurring is that businesses are being set up across the country that are simply pass-throughs to secondary companies, and then there is no oversight that is seeing that this is stuff that actually benefits who these programs are designed to provide value to. The second thing is the shell company. This is where a contract is passed on to another company after they've skimmed anywhere from that 10 to 50% off the top that we talked about earlier. We've heard about the USAID and the bribery and collusion, where a contracting officer takes the bribes to steer contracts to a specific 8A participant, and that's what happened with USAID, and all those funds were cut off. The other thing that we're starting to see problems with is that there's false certifications. And this is where the company is misrepresenting their eligibility to qualify, usually in who actually is the owner or the controlling shareholder or the controlling executive director of that particular entity or company that is applying for 8A status. What has happened after January 5th and the deadline, January 5th, 2026, and the deadline for submitting these financial records is that the administrator of the Small Business Administration, Administrator Loeffler, has ordered that a full-scale audit of all high-value 8A contracts for the past 15 years now be looked at, because they're concerned that these certain initiatives that were set forth by the Biden administration have created an environment that is highly fraught with fraud and misrepresentation of the money here. We're a few minutes away from our commercial break here. I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of what's going to happen in the second segment of our show here. We're going to be talking about a nonprofit organization that I highlighted back in October of last year as being one that had, I will say, wire transferred money to a fraudulent recipient, thinking that they were transferring this money to another nonprofit that had previously been a sub-grantee of money from the state. We'll be talking about that in detail, taking a real deep dive into what is happening here in nonprofits in Connecticut. But what we've been talking about for this first segment is this 8A program through the Small Business Administration. We've seen fraud across the United States in the form of SNAP benefits and WIC programs that I've talked about on previous episodes in the past few weeks. We've seen it with housing that we've talked about in the past few weeks on previous shows of Right Now. And we've also talked about some of the fraud and abuse that is happening through the nonprofits across the country. So these are all things that, I think are starting to come together as we've had multiple episodes to discuss this stuff. And I'm going to continue to provide you with some of this information because these are evolving stories. These are things that I think are generally being ignored by a lot of the mainstream media. You heard a little bit of the shocking information about the 8A programs last July. And I've referred to this a few times in this past 20-minute segment about USAID. And I think it's important that we recognize that this type of fraud and abuse of taxpayer funds is something that we do have control over. This is something that we can decide that we want to do a better job of controlling by voting in legislators who do want to address these things. We do want to look at audits that are forensic audits that really dive deep into where money not only is coming from, but where it's going to, who recipients are, and to make sure this is done in a very transparent way so that taxpayers can see where their money is being spent. In Connecticut, we have a large complex of nonprofits, many of them doing very, very good work for people who desperately need help in Connecticut, but it's also become something that is fraught with abuse. We've talked about this now on the federal level with the Small Business Administration and other programs in previous episodes of Right Now. We're going to be taking a break in just a moment. When we come back, we're going to be talking about what is happening here, local to us. These are nonprofits that are being investigated by not only the FBI, but also the Department of Justice. And it's important for us as Connecticut taxpayers to realize that the first step in affordability is to get rid of a lot of this fraud and abuse in the system that we need to be careful of. If you'd like to hear any of our previous episodes on Right Now, you can always go to WILI.com. Thank you for listening into WI 95.3 FM for our first episode of Right Now. My name is Chris Reddy. We'll be back after our commercial break. Welcome back to Right Now. I'm Chris Reddy here on 95.3 FM, WILI, and 1400 AM. You can also listen to any of these previous episodes of Right Now by going to WILI.com. Go to the podcasts, pull down to Right Now, and you can select any of our previous episodes you can listen to at any time. You can just go to YouTube. We're on video here in studio. You can watch on YouTube to see what it's like to be here in studio on Right Now. Again, I want to thank our producer, Matt, for being in studio with us every week. I'm by myself as the host, but I always have Matt here helping out and doing a great job filling in. Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, you do a good job. You do a really good job here, so
that's awesome. I'm glad. I hope the listeners feel that way also. I'm glad that we were able to expand our programming from not only just my show, but also one of my co-hosts has his own show Mondays in the same time slot from 3 to 4 o'clock. That's Mike DeSoniers, and he has the show Unfiltered. Be sure to tune in there to listen to local Willimantic and Windham political issues provided by Mike DeSoniers, member of the City Council. My co-host, who's usually here and was here last week, Curtis Ayler, is out working hard, making sure that everybody stays warm during this cold snap after our storm this past week. How did you guys make out this past week? Did you do okay, Matt?
I did all right, but I didn't have to shovel too much. But where I live, they do the shoveling, but I had to do a fair amount, so it was rough.
So I have a driveway that's like 900 feet long.
Oh wow!
And
Jeez.
This, like, we had to do it in 3 stages with the snow blowers.
Yeah.
Because it was a lot of snow. It looks like everybody did a good job on my way in and over the past couple of days. I want to thank everybody who was out there from DOT, all the city municipal workers who were plowing and clearing out, all of our first responders who had to spend time away from their families. Thank you very much for everything you did during the storm. Myself being a first responder for 30 years, I've spent plenty of time, holidays and snowstorms, away from family, and it's an incredibly difficult situation to be there and worried about what's going on at home while you're also worried about what's happening in your community. So thank you to all the people who not only spent time away from family working to make sure that our communities were clear of snow and safe, but also all of our essential workers in the way of healthcare workers who spent time away from their families and probably on long shifts throughout the weekend during the snowstorm at our local hospitals and medical centers. So thank you all for doing that. We appreciate it very much. We are back here with our second segment on Right Now, where we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the fraud and abuse of funding that happens in our government. And we're going to take a step away from the federal government, which I spent the first segment talking about, specifically the Small Business Administration's 8A program that really opened up a number of concerns last year from federal government auditing, and we're starting to see similar things happening here on a state level. One of the things that I always want to provide as part of the show is to make sure that we are talking about state legislative issues and things that are going on in Hartford that affect all of us as taxpayers. If you remember last week, one of the things that I discussed was with regard to being an electrical ratepayer and a workshop that was provided to the PURA Regulatory Board, the quasi-judicial board that oversees legislative control of our electrical regulatory rates, and how they were presented with a workshop and reimbursed this nonprofit that provides input to PURA through this workshop, representing approximately 10 to 15 individuals in the state of Connecticut. They were reimbursed $200,000 for their workshop that they provided to PURA and Eversource. And that is now something that has been added to the public benefits charge of your electric bill, as if that doesn't need to go up any higher. Now, we've also talked last week about how in Massachusetts, a energy policy analyst specifically said that the single greatest driving force of the increase in our electrical bills is not only legislative policy and bad legislative policy that is layered on top of itself year after year and legislative cycle after legislative cycle that creates an overlapping financial burden on the ratepayers of these states in New England, because we're all in the same boat. You could be in Connecticut, you could be in Rhode Island, you could be in Massachusetts, you could be in New Hampshire, Vermont. It doesn't matter. We still are all in the same boat because we rely heavily on natural gas for the production of and the generation of our electricity, and we are at the end, the terminal end of those pipelines, and nobody's helping us to increase that. That is the cheapest form. We did provide funding for Millstone back in 2017. That provides for about 30% of our electrical generating capacity. We also now have these renewable portfolio standard initiatives that have been added year after year after year that further compel us to spend state taxpayer and ratepayer money through our public benefits charges to forward the green agenda and to provide more solar and more wind generation other green forms of energy. And we can all agree that we want that to be an end goal. We want to increase that, but it's got to be at a market demand. It can't be forced on us by legislators who don't understand the dynamics of the very difficult situation that Connecticut is in by allowing Eversource to be a monopoly in our state. Excuse me. This is something we've dealt with for the better part of 40 to 50 years. And it's always going to be a struggle because we don't allow for competitive distribution rates set by several different generators of electricity or electrical companies in our state. This energy policy analyst said specifically that the single thing that has caused our electrical rates in southern New England to increase over the past few years is policy, is legislative policy, and that's what we need to change to control some of our electrical rates. And this is something that I brought up last week. That's why I'm trying to kind of coming roundabout with this. Now I want to look at something that I discussed back in, I want to say late October. This had to do with a senator for the area representing Windsor, Bloomfield, and a portion of Hartford, and I want to say specifically it was like the north end of Hartford. What had happened last year was that, and I'll actually take a step back here, $300,000 was wire transferred from a Hartford nonprofit to what they believed was another nonprofit that they had provided funding for in the past. And this is a regular practice in Hartford, is that you have larger nonprofits that receive greater amounts of funding and then disperse funding to smaller nonprofits across their area. It really allows for very little transparency, very little accountability in this. So I brought this up last year when this first broke, and there's been recent updates that I want to bring up now. Specifically, what happened this past Tuesday was that an audit was released. And this was an audit that was called for by the Department of Economic and Community Development, and the forensic audit was performed by an independent agency out of Hartford that's called Clifton, Larson, and Allen, LLP. You can Google this. You can find the audit available online, and I confirmed very much of this information with other news sources to make sure that we're providing accurate information. But I do want to provide a disclaimer that these are allegations that are being provided by a forensic audit from an independent accounting agency in Hartford that was contracted by the Department of Economic and Community Development to look at this after their concerns were brought about by this fraudulent wire transfer of $300,000 this past year. What's significant about this wire transfer and what really threw up a lot of red flags was that the wire transfer occurred in October of 2024, but it wasn't reported until March of 2025 to the Department of Economic Development, Economic and Community Development. And immediately that throws up red flags as to why something that fraudulent and that shocking to have $300,000 sent as a wire transfer and to simply disappear would not be brought to the attention of the state of Connecticut before that. So let me describe some of these nonprofits that are being looked at and investigated by not only the Department of Justice, but also now the state of Connecticut. One of them is one that's been around for a very long time, like 60 years. And this is called the Blue Hills Civic Association. It provides employment opportunities for young adults in Hartford. It for a long time provided after-school activities for children, lots of things that everybody can get behind. And I'm sure there's still initiatives that it has that we can all still agree with. Unfortunately, because of what has happened with some of this fraudulent, some of these concerns of fraud and through this fraudulent wire transfer, is that their funding was frozen last year, and the Blue Hills Civics Association has had to close down. One of the other ones that's involved here, I mentioned before in the October episode, and this is the one that's called Sheba Resource Center. It's SHEBA, Resource Center, Inc. And what Sheba stands for is Society for Human Engagement and Business Alignment. So it's another one of these nonprofits with a very interesting sounding name that sounds like it's doing fantastic work. The concern that we have here is that Blue Hills Civic Association, Sheba Resource Center, Inc., and the executive director of Sheba, who also has a consulting company, along with several other nonprofit organizations, I'll list a few of them for you. The Upper Albany Neighborhood Collaborative, the YMCA of Greater Hartford, the Prosperity Foundation, HEDCO, Girls for Technology. These are all nonprofits that are now being investigated because of their ties to the Blue Hills Civic Association and the Sheba Resource Center. This is a very, very convoluted and difficult, I will say, audit report to not only look at and decipher, but the findings of this audit really indicate that there was such a lack of really proper financial record keeping, proper like ledgers in their book of money being transferred back and forth between these nonprofits, that there's a lot of things that we really don't have answers for, but I'm going to try and break it down for you right now because some of this is just absolutely incredible. Some of the things that not only these nonprofits were claiming that they were using funds for, but also how this money was mismanaged, transferred back and forth, and now there's no accountability afterwards because nobody can seem to find out where some of this money has gone. So we're going to start off with the Sheba Resource Center, Inc. The executive director here is a woman whose name is Sonsarai Cicero Hamlin. She's the executive director, and she also owns a consulting firm. A total of $1.7 million of state allocated funding has gone to her nonprofit, this Sheba Resource Center, Inc. $1.1 million over 2022 and 2023, and then $615,000 in 2025 was paid as a pass-through from another one of these nonprofit organizations. To give you an idea of some of the things that Sheba has requested as payment for as part of their operating expenses and services that they have provided for other nonprofits that have contributed to this pass-through of funds, I'm going to list for you right now. And some of these are just incredible. Right? According to this forensic audit that was done by the Hartford accounting group Clifton Larson Allen LLP, on the order of the Department of Economic and Community Development, they found that Sheba Resource Center, Inc. of Hartford received two payments totaling $84,000. This is $42,000 each for 300 hours, which means that they were getting paid about $280 an hour for work updating the Blue Hills Civic Association's employee handbook. Yet there is no, and this is the exact wording in the audit, there is no evidence of substantive work products, meaningful policy update, or documented involvement by Cicero Hamlin. So she got paid $84,000 for 300 hours worth of work that nobody can identify she did. This is the next one, and this one is amazing. She was paid $42,000 for staff training This was for a 2-hour session that involved a 6-slide PowerPoint presentation, a 13-minute YouTube video, and then a 30-minute breakout session. And they billed the state of Connecticut $42,000 for that. There's a $28,000 fee for developing new board policies and $14,000 for training board directors of the Blue Hills Civic Association. That never happened. There's $50,000 in scholarships that were never awarded, but instead, according to this forensic audit, a number of large irregular transactions unrelated to scholarships occurred. There was $5,000 that was paid to a SHIBA board member without any explanation. There was $250,000 appropriated for an internship with this nonprofit organization that never happened. And here's my favorite part of this whole audit. The audit says that public funds were distributed to SHIBA, specifically Cicero Hamlin, based on invoices and budget claims that lacked substantiation and included charges to Netflix, Amazon, BJ's Wholesale Club, Target, Walgreens, Walmart, and $7,748 payment on someone's Discover card. Are you kidding me, Connecticut? We can do better than this. This is absolutely absurd. Why are we even having these conversations? Do you realize that we are paying someone's grocery bill and Discover card on our taxpayer funds through nonprofits? Give me a break. All right? This continues. All right? I'm not even at the end here. We're going to continue with this a little bit more. Some of the other concerns that this audit found. Nonprofit funding for a restaurant named Don's Kitchen in Windsor. Now, it's fine if money goes specifically to that organization if it's supporting a nonprofit. But if you remember, I mentioned one of these companies just a moment ago. It's referred to as HEDCO, H-E-D-C-O. They are actually a small business loan and services company. That money for Don's Kitchen was awarded to HEDCO through the Blue Hills Civic Association on the understanding that there would be a reimbursement from another one of these nonprofits. So money's just being shuffled around like your regular shell game. It's just ripe for fraud. No one can account for where this money is going to. And now we're going to get into another couple of these connected nonprofits. And really the point that I want to get across right now is the conclusion of this audit is that these nonprofits are so deficient in their record keeping, their monitoring, their financial reporting practices, that there's no way that an audit can even conclusively determine to what extent this fraud is occurring under. But we're going to continue talking about this. Another one of these Hartford nonprofits, this one is called the Prosperity Foundation. Now, the Prosperity Foundation's initiatives, according to its website, are to promote philanthropy, prosperity, and self-empowerment in the Black community. Again, who's not going to agree with this type of an initiative? It was created by a small business owner. He actually owns a funeral home in Hartford. He serves on the Minority Business Initiative Advisory Council, along with the senator who I had mentioned previously, who is being looked at by the FBI and by the Department of Justice for his connection to these nonprofits. Well, the Prosperity Foundation, if we look back just even in the past few years, since like 2021. $1.1 million through the Blue Hills Civic Association in 2024 flowed from Blue Hills Civic Association to the Prosperity Foundation. But this forensic audit can only account for $328,124 of that $1.1 million being spent, which leaves $771,000 in change unspent and not returned as it's supposed to be done at the end of that fiscal year. An important thing to also note is that the Prosperity Foundation also suffered a wire fraud transaction dilemma in 2023 when they wire transferred $500,000 to a recipient that turned out to be fraudulent. The majority of that money, again, never recovered, never accounted for. Nobody can explain what happened. That same year, I will also make a point to say that half of the state allocated funding for the Prosperity Foundation came from the Social Equity Council's Community Reinvestment Grant Program. You ever heard of that, Matt?
No.
Okay. Most people haven't, but you're going to recognize exactly where this money comes from. The Social Equity Council's Community Reinvestment Grant Program is the tax revenue from cannabis sales in Connecticut. These sales are supposed to provide grants to community organizations in disproportionately impacted areas. And again, we can all get along with that and say, yes, we want to help out people that are disproportionately impacted by whether it was the war on drugs, which is supposedly what this was to benefit. The concern is that, again, there's fraudulent issues with the cannabis funding from the executive director who had to resign in 2024 over allegations of specifically directing nonprofit funding to certain organizations that were favored by individuals sitting on that council. Right? These are things that we have to be concerned about. We have to look at this because when there's no transparency, people are going to take advantage of these situations. So, one of the big concerns about this Social Equity Council that distributes the cannabis fund money is, again, that lack of transparency, poor communications, and inconsistency of criteria in the distribution of this grant money. And as I said before, it forced the executive director to resign in 2024. With the Prosperity Foundation in Hartford and its connection to some of these other nonprofits, you see the same names of these nonprofits coming up over and over and over again in all of these allegations that are being made of money being funneled and passed through from one nonprofit organization to another. And those are the things that we really need to look at from a legislative standpoint as to whether or not these should be allowed to continue. One of the things that I noticed when I was working on the Appropriations Committee from the beginning of 2025 through June of 2025 during that legislative session was that there was when the first budget got dropped very early in May, there was pages of nonprofits that had gone through no vetting process. They had provided no memorandum of understanding where there is a specific goal in their mind to achieve with money that they are asking for from state appropriations. This is something that we need to look at. It was simply earmarks that were made by a state representative or a state legislator vouching for these nonprofits and saying that there is $62,500 that needs to go to this one, $800,000 to this nonprofit. There was no vetting process where these nonprofits had to come in front of legislators and say, this is what we represent, these are our initiatives, these are the goals that we have, this is how we're going to utilize taxpayer money, and you can come and take a look at all of our paperwork and we'll show you our results at the end of this. That is not a process that is happening. We need to end this pass-through of awarding grant money to one nonprofit organization organization where it is simply then dispersed to other nonprofit organizations that are not going to meet the criteria that we're looking for here. We all want to help out people that are needy. We all want to help out people that truly need the assistance of Connecticut taxpayers. We don't want to do it in a fraudulent manner. Okay? There has to be monitoring during the grant year. When monies are being dispersed to these nonprofits, there has to be monitoring during the program, and it can't simply be end-of-the-year reporting that we're following up on, because that's how these things happen. Again, specific contracts have to be signed with these nonprofits outlining what their expectations are, what the results they're going to produce, and if they don't produce results, we need to look at whether these nonprofits should continue to have funding from state taxpayer money. We are coming to the top of the hour and almost the end of the show. We have about 5 minutes left. So we're going to give you a little bit of a preview here and kind of wrap up what we've been talking about today. I'm not done talking about affordability in Connecticut, but this is one of the things that we can do as taxpayers and voters in the future to help control a lot of this rampant fraud that I'm happy and glad to be able to provide to you as listeners. This is something that's important because it has been one-party rule in the state of Connecticut for decades. And when that happens, it opens up this opportunity for these type of things to happen, where we have a complex not only of nonprofits but also unions that spend huge amounts of money lobbying and legislating in Hartford and really swaying the outcome of our elections. And that's going to be coming up in one of the future episodes that I highlighted back at the beginning of January. We're going to continue to talk about not only fraud that's being uncovered in Connecticut, but also some of the issues that directly are affecting not only affordability in Connecticut, but also your safety. One of the things that I will be bringing up in one of the next couple of episodes, and I have some great guests who are lined up for future episodes also, but I want to talk about not only the Trust Act and the enhancement of the Trust Act that has occurred over the past several legislative sessions that really do not make us a safer state. One thing that I've said over and over again is that Connecticut does not have a decrease in crime. It has a decrease in the prosecution of crime, and that is absolutely a fact. When you look at some of the national statistics that are just starting to come out now from 2025, where you're seeing 20 to 25% drops in homicide, carjacking, violent crimes. Those are significant numbers that we have to try to understand why this has happened and to really assess some of the sanctuary state policies of some of these blue states. So we'll be talking about those things coming up in some of our future episodes. To kind of wrap up things for today, what we've been talking about first was the Small Business Administration's 8A program. I think this is something that from a national news standpoint has really been overlooked. We heard about it a little bit last July with USAID and the $550 million bribery scheme that was uncovered. And now we're uncovering a lot more fraud through not only these pass-through companies, but also shell corporations that are taking advantage of 8A Small Business Administration status benefits, but not actually performing all the tasks and simply skimming profits off the top that are driving our costs up substantially as tax. I'll continue to follow those specific stories that I've been talking about for this second segment in some upcoming episodes, but I also want to talk about some of the things that we'll be covering in the next couple of months, because we are getting to a very important election cycle. One of the things that I always think about kicking off the statewide elections in January is something that I'll be attending tonight, which is the Grassroots East dinner down in Norwich at the Holiday Inn. This is always a great event and draws a crowd of a couple of hundred people to Norwich for what really turns out to be a good event early in the year to bring together conservatives, talk about some of the issues that each of us are seeing across Eastern Connecticut, and to really look towards this next election cycle for 2026. Being a midterm election, I think it's going to be one that is going to be very impactful for the next couple of years, not only from a federal level, but also for state legislative issues. We do have a short legislative cycle that will be starting on February 3rd here in Hartford, running for 13 weeks. That legislative cycle is going to be one that really deals with budgetary adjustments and appropriations rather than a lot of the committee issues that the longer legislative cycle that occurred in 2025 and will be upcoming in the 2027 cycle after our elections. But I plan on having more political guests in the way of not only state-level candidates, but also some of our federal candidates that will be up for election to keep you well informed as listeners to Right Now. I thank you for another episode here on WILI 95.3 FM and 1400 AM. This has been Right Now with Chris Reddy, and I will talk to you next Thursday at 3 o'clock.